Hi, everybody, and welcome to tonight's really exciting talk with Chloe Sorvino and friends, talking about her awesome new book, Raw Deal. Sorry I'm late to the stage. I got swept up in some conversations. I am really, really excited. This is our third talk. We've done a lot of different events at the space. We moved into the space about 1.5 years ago in the midst of the crazy pandemic. We moved 4 times in about 11 months as the pandemic kind of hit the city. We were able to move that many times and grow thanks to many faces in this room tonight and many New Yorkers who were looking for food and chose to support regional, local food from sources that you can trust and learn about and read about, and that means a lot to me personally, and so I want to thank you all for that. And this space has many functions. First and foremost, right behind this wall is our warehouse. So literally 6 days a week, we are packing out your orders. We have a fridge, a freezer, a kitchen, a packing room. This space actually functions as both this venue and our box packing room. And so all of our boxes every day get packed out of here, get loaded into vehicles, and go all around the city to customers' doors. And then we also want this space to be a place for the community to come and to learn about the food system and to learn about our makers and great people that are spotlighting critical issues within the food system, like our panelists tonight. And so without further ado, I want to get started, but I just wanted to give everybody a little bit of that background. And thank you all again so much for coming, trying our food. Thank you to our chef Scott for making some of our dishes tonight. And really excited for the conversation ahead. I think Chloe, Chloe, you're leaving me alone. And Qiana Mickie. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you all for being here. This is so exciting. Michael, thanks for having us. Anya, thank you. Rachel, everyone, excited.
Me too.
Cool. Yes. Okay. So, I don't know, I wanted to kick this off talking about why re-regionalizing the food system is so important. Michael, you can lead us if you so wish, but you know.
Well, I mean, sure. I mean, I think for me, I think that coming from, I guess coming from I have to like start sort of like even further back because I can't take all the credit for like why I know what I know about the food system, and it's really because of my upbringing, because of the education that I got. My father had natural retail stores in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in New York, and was kind of at the beginning of the natural products revolution. And we got to go to Europe and see a lot of how those farmers markets and different, I mean, literally different regions of Italy or different regions of France or different regions of Greece had just completely like their own food culture and farms and foods and all of that. And then you come back to this kind of sterilized America where we're getting, produce from California and meat from Texas and not a lot from New York. And so I started working at the farmer's market in my senior year of high school. I went to a Waldorf school. And luckily, like I literally went to a regenerative farm called Hawthorne Valley for farm trips. And so that is just knowing how good regional food is and how important it is to support our local farmers in this region and across the world, that I think became a passion and why I want to continue to do what I do every day.
So let's talk about, so you're the CEO and co-founder of Farm to People, which is hosting us too. So also can you
Oh, sorry, I didn't introduce you.
Qiana, I want to make sure you introduce yourself and share the roles and the hats that you're wearing tonight.
Oh yeah, I'm wearing multiple hats. So hi everybody, I'm Qiana Mickie. I'm here tonight as a food systems leader, consultant. I've worked in the landscape on policy and food and programming, connecting community to farmers for about over 12 years now. And I've done different work, and that's the voice and experience I wanted to share tonight, and what you'll find in the book as well. But the elephant in the room is some people might know me from my day job, and my day job is I'm the city's first urban agriculture director, and I started the city's first urban agriculture office. So I'm not speaking with that city hat tonight, but if folks are interested to learn more or want to talk to me in that capacity, I can give you information on how to reach me there. So I'm not here as a city representative, but I think it will give for a rich conversation.
Ask the right questions and you'll maybe get the right answers.
Exactly. And if I use my second drink ticket, like who knows what else I'll say. But for me, when I think about regionalizing the food system, I thought maybe it would be good for me to kind of share, like, if I start from like sky view to the ground, the ground being myself, sky view being bigger, is, I think a lot of us know part of why we need to do it is because we're on fire. Like, shit is burning. We cannot continue to live the way we live. We can't continue to stay in food systems that are extractive, exploitative to people, extractive to our natural resources. And we can't keep saying that this is going to feed us. And we can't keep keeping those practices and hoping that it's going to get better. I think, regionalizing, it's actually can also be thought of as just going back to indigenous practices and cultures. I think it's going back to the things, the practices, agricultural practices, food practices, cultural practices that we still hold. And when we think of food, oftentimes we think of those things, but we know them to be regenerative. We know them to be ecological. We know them to be, they've kept multiple cultures living and thriving even through multiple struggles. So I think it's part of considering it like that is like, what do we know now? What have we learned? We need things that are going to keep us moving forward. We need healthy soil. We need healthy food. We need healthy water. That can no longer be seen as like a hippie thing to say or the fringe. It needs to be what we're doing now. And we need folks to, we need our policy, and we need folks to feel like that's how we survive. I think, taking it down to like a regional level, even in the midst of crisis, what I saw was bigger supply chains breaking and falling apart. I think we saw community and businesses finding ways to connect to our regional food system, supporting our watershed and thinking about how we can still get food. So when we're now thinking about, well, what can we build on? It's not just what we did in the past, it's also what do we learn? How do we recover? How do we learn from crisis? Because we're not gonna get out of crisis. So to me, it's also about what did we learn about resiliency? What did we learn about who shows up when it's time to grow food? How do we learn how to be self-reliant and build our autonomy in terms of growing food and understanding that? And how do we value that? So even if it feels like the crisis is over, which we know it isn't, we cannot get to a point where we go back to safety. And we can't also rely on just emergency or crisis food or rescue. We need to figure out how do we support localized food production, whether it's at the individual level to community level to businesses that have that mission. How do we start redefining our economies of scale, building multiplier effects in our region? And also I think too, if we're thinking about our region, that includes, depending on how you define it, either upstate and down or our surrounding states. And I think it's also redefining our economies of scale. And instead of comparing ourselves to industrial ag, industrial food systems, it's really starting to define what are the alternatives. Because the reality is we are living in capitalism, but it doesn't mean that we can't build alternative models. And I think, farming people is like a good example of that. I think we've seen, other models of that. So how do you do both? I really think it's a both and. So I think, if folks feel like it's new for them, I think let's take heart that this is actually not new. But I think what we can do is not, it's being sensitive about not co-opting and not marginalizing, but how do we learn to build to next? How do you connect to what was already there? I think sometimes people, especially even in our crisis, they, jumped into food because then food became scarce, and then we marginalize like the resilient models that were already here, farmers markets, CSAs, community ag, and for a lot of folks, that was their lifeline for food. That was a lifeline of what they were growing. So we don't have to just jump in and be like, oh, we figured out a new way to like connect, or we connect to just emergency, food security. It's like, I think for moving forward, if we're gonna re-envision our regional, it's about how do we build resiliency, how do we move towards sovereignty, and what did we miss in that time? Do we need policy? Do we need reform? Do we need other businesses? How do we support each other in our work and businesses? So for me, that's just why I do the work that I do.
Oh, I love it. And, we've known each other for years. Actually,
Yes.
we actually were first set up on another panel for Food Tank about like 7 years ago, maybe. And I know.
Oh my God, yeah.
So what we talk about, so even before you had this role with the city, you were quoted in my book really about what you just were talking about, how to bake equity into this alternative system that hasn't really been able to get the scale that it needs. You talked about CSAs, co-ops.
Yes.
They've been around for so long. You're a Food Hub,
Yes.
certified consultant.
Yes.
And so I think, it's about looking at this history, but also about infrastructure history too. Yes. And I'd love to hear, and we can talk about it, but, you're building infrastructure here and you're working within existing infrastructure and trying to make it stronger. So what are the infrastructure needs we need? Because, there were, decades and hundreds of years of canneries and different plants and, facilities that made, local purveyors, more artisanal type products able to, get produced and get out to the market without, with less additives, with less, processing. But that's all been really stripped away as industrial agriculture has centralized and really, taken out so many of these profits and hoarded them.
I mean, one of the things that comes to mind really immediately and is also, I guess, like plays into like a lot of the topics in your book, but is on-farm processing. So many farms that we go and visit are raising cattle or beef, cattle or pork or chickens in a great way, but then the trucking to a processor, the slotting fees at the processor, all of these things add so many dollars and costs that really then I don't think like most consumers can't bear it and a lot of farmers can't bear it. So it's like the raising of the animal is done the way that I think everyone in this room would be like, I want to eat and support that operation and eat that meat. But then by the time it goes through all of the hoops it has to go through to get packaged in a USDA approved package that is saleable to you, it becomes a really expensive product. And I think the wrong people are profiting from a large share of that price. And so I think that's a hard need in infrastructure today, at least regionally, but probably further afield as well.
Totally, I agree. I think when we think about the gaps in our infrastructure, I think it does lie in food processing, building value-added products, and how do we do that regionally or locally so you're connecting businesses to each other. I think it's also the packaging processing, even minimal processing. Like oftentimes we don't think, let's say like an apple or potato, like even just processing to chop it in a way that multiple institutions could use it or even families would want to use it. We don't really have those options, whether it's a regional scale. There's not a lot of options for that. I think the other thing too, it's how do we get our food in the region? Most of the time we're relying or assume we're doing trucking and logistics as such. And so now you're figuring out gas and tolls and, all that, which can be really hard for farmers to try to manage, but they still have to factor that cost. And I think something, even also connecting it back to like thinking about our region again, is we live in this such vibrant region. Like, are we going back to thinking about rail? Are we going back to maritime freight? And like, how do we reduce the miles traveled that our food has to take? So not just when we talk about it in broad strokes in terms of food flying in, but are there even things that we're missing out in bringing food down?
I love that.
Yeah, and also like we should not always be seen in the downstate, like at the 5 boroughs, as the end consumer. I think part of what we need to build is also, because end consumer, whether that's food pantry, because it's the end life cycle of food, or it's the end consumer in terms of who's buying, but I think we should also start building a more localized food hubs, cooperatives that are also working on building the processing that we need and growing the food here, manufacturing.
Yeah. I also want to like add in, because I think I loved what you said about the things that really inspired Farm to People, and I don't want those things, CSAs, farmers markets, to be things that we're trying to be better than or replace. Right. I think when I think about the model that we're trying to create, I think about conversations I have with people, and I ask them, like, how often do you, how do you want to shop? Everyone's like, oh, I want to support local, I want to go to the farmer's market. How often do you go to the farmer's market? Right. Oh, maybe once a month.
Right.
So then that's not your shopping. And so to me, it's like, how can Farm to People fill that gap for the consumers that aren't the farmer's market regulars, that aren't the CSA like supporters? How can we make eating that way a viable, convenient solution that's better than just defaulting to your local grocery store? Yeah.
It can't be, I think so much of our food systems has been very binary, and I think, it's an either or, and I really do think it's a both and. I think we are continuing to see we need businesses to work at a certain scale. We need multiple scales. We need multiple options. We need multiple price points. Because even for farmers, what the price point is at a CSA is different than what they could possibly sell at farmers market, what they would do if they do wholesale, and what they do if they like sell in a cooperative or retail. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's just, again, playing with the right economies, and I think we can do that with different models.
Totally.
And I mean, let's talk though about farmers markets, right? Because I mean, even farmers markets are a little problematic in how, they don't really ask the consumer that even if they are using it once a month or if they're doing it more, they're not really taking an active role in how they're getting their food. And those farmers markets are often, having fees or different logistical issues. These farmers are often not making money. Often they're losing money on going to these markets, and the workers there probably don't have health care, probably aren't, facing really long work weeks, et cetera.
Sure.
Lots of different protections that they don't get, And so I think it has to be a patchwork of these systems like overlaying on top of each other.
Like strategic models that work. Now, I'm never going to say no to farmers markets, so I don't want anybody leaving there with that. But I think what you're talking about too, or what you're lifting up, is some of the economic constraints of trying to work with our existing food system. And I think also just the limitations around like accessibility, affordability, and the other pressures, like how can I grow food in a way that brings value, in a way that's good to the soil, good to people, and still in this current economy, sell it at a price point that's fair to me and fair to my workers. How do I do that? And I think we have these external pressures that force people to make hard choices, or some people feel like the only way to change that is scale. Like, how do we exploit before we figure out another way? And I think just farmers markets, just like CSAs, just like other businesses, it can be hard when you're trying to run an operation and you're trying to stay in the red, how to figure out how to deal with the larger pressures. And I think that's why we need to support alternative models. So if any farmer has that option or choice, any community that brings in a farmer's market can have that choice, so it's not the only way they can get food or the only way they can sell.
I also want to talk about funding too, because you're quoted in my book about how, it's essentially the quote is like, alternative protein's been getting billions of dollars in funding. It's this funding frenzy, but if local systems could just get $100,000, they would be able to make so much of a difference just with that. So I want to talk about that. Also, Michael, I mean, Farm to People has been bootstrapped.
Yes.
You've been eschewing, raising it from outside investors and bringing in outside capital, and that's very rare in this food system. But I want to go into that a bit more.
Sure. I mean, why don't you start with the model that you're working with?
I mean,
And why did you push against investors? I think that would be helpful for folks to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's multifaceted, but I think one of them is that the type of food system that I believe in doesn't scale the way venture capitalists want it to scale, which is not in like a 5-year timeline to $1 billion. I do think that there is a multi-billion-dollar like opportunity because everybody eats, and it's a huge and we can change it in a big way.
Yeah.
But it's going to take grassroots efforts in cities and towns and regions across the country and across the world to do that. And I think that answering to people that are just like literally looking at your bottom line and your and your cash burn and how do we stop that and and your CAC and all of these things that are I mean important to finance people,
right,
but maybe not important to like the farmer. And I don't want to. I think it's very important that like a business like ours doesn't have to change our mission and what
right,
types of farms that we want to go to at the expense or because I sort of lose my job because we're not growing fast enough or something like that.
Because a lot of startups do end up getting that investor pressure and then do end up having to make decisions against their mission and everything. We hear the horror stories.
Yeah, I mean, are the founders of Imperfect there? Are the founders of Good Eggs there? Are the founders of Fresh Direct there? I mean, no, across the board.
Yeah, I think, what I've heard from even businesses that are mission aligned but want to be, but are food startups is when they start to have to decide what avenue they're going to take their business, you have to wonder, if I give somebody equity, how much pressure they're going to have in how I grow or what I do. And I think that is something that can get really hard and then make choices like you're making in terms of how you fund the work that you want to do because you still want to have that autonomy. I think to kind of speak to the inequity of funding, something that we see but we don't often tease out, even in our food system, is, when we look at food tech, venture capitalist-backed food-based work, alternative proteins, other forms of food tech, hydroponic farming, when you look, if you actually unpack it, they're working in a sector that's built for them to fail, but get funded to fail. It's figure it out and we'll pay you to keep doing it more. There's, just certain levels of money that just boggles my mind, where it's you get to fail. You get to get millions on something that still needs to figure out oftentimes how to put nutrition back in, still hasn't really addressed energy. And that's not actually anything that you necessarily have to say when you're starting up, because you're able to build your proof of concept and your context however you want that deck to be. That's not the same for, mission-aligned folks. It's not the same for community ag, because most of their funding are coming from philanthropy. Most of their funding are coming from individuals funding. Even family foundations, the difference in who is funding makes such a difference. And what you have to prove to get grant funding, what you have to prove to get government funding, the thresholds are so different than in venture capitalists. And I'll tell you, whether you're black or brown, community ag, if your funding is coming from philanthropy, you don't really get a chance to fail. And I will tell you, even just being someone in the space, being somebody of color, we don't get chances to fail. We have to be perfect, or we have to be seen as perfect, or it has to feel like the feel-good story. We don't get to get $50 million and then maybe grow some food. We don't get, we just don't. You don't have
so problematic.
Even for an urban farm, even a commercial farm, you don't get to do that. So the sectors are different. The way funding comes in is different. So there's already built-in inequity. There's also an assumption around capital, whether it's generational wealth or it's somebody willing to build your business. Even when I was a nonprofit ED, I would have people come to me and have me try to justify 20 different ways how I was leveraging their $5,000 grant. Or tell me I couldn't leverage a $200,000 grant just because I had a $500,000 nonprofit. Even though everything I was doing was in the red, and took an organization that had gone, red, black, sorry. I've been fucking it up all night. I had to come into an organization that had, unfortunately, was on the brink of closure, even though well-respecting and long-standing, and everything I had to do in order to prove that equity was needed and this work was needed was to fund bootstraps. So everything, I didn't have the chance to fail. No one said, here's $10 million, Qiana, turn this organization around even though you're doing this great work. It was whatever you're doing with my $10,000, $5,000, $20,000, I need a grant report, I need an interim report, I need a progress report, and I need to see, even in a nonprofit space, how you're gonna turn it around. I wish somebody gave me $10 million. I'd love to have a chance of $10 million.
All the lab-grown meat fellows that have raised hundreds of millions and are still unprofitable and, you know.
Yeah, and still unprofitable. And I think the other thing too is not just also the funding, it's just the mission alignment. Farm to people, you know, farmers, you know, community ag. We're not trying to fail because we know people need actual food. We are not playing around with it. We might want to experiment. We might want to try new crops. We would love a little bit of dollars in case, you know, there's flooding or stuff. But we understand how important the food is to get to people. Every crop matters. Every radish matters. Every, you know, piece, every item that you're growing matters. And it's not just because it matters because you're selling it, but folks have this mission and commitment because they understand what it takes in the larger ecosystem. And I don't always see that in some of the more venture capitalist space.
I was just going to add one thing because I think it relates to both funding and also infrastructure, because it's not quite infrastructure, but technology. And I think like technology is one of those things that is so needed and so vital in making regional systems effective and efficient and profitable.
Yeah.
But also technology is, speaking personally from our business, one of the most expensive things to invest in. And I think that's where so many like tech companies that are tech first, like need to raise millions of dollars is purely for a lot of that technology. And I think that, like, speaking of government grant, like I think there should be more of an emphasis from government to help small businesses compete technologically, help farmers with technology, help farm to people with technology. Right. Like that's an infrastructure piece that is going to be crucial to making sure that we're the best we can be at helping farms. So that was just something that.
Well, you'll have to apply for a feasibility study. You'll have to apply for a research grant to get the feasibility study. You have to have the money and the capacity to do that. Then prove that you need it, and then maybe somebody will. You see, these are the realities.
So we're gonna end this a little soon, and hopefully if there's some questions and answers, so everyone start thinking about them now. I got like one or two more questions before we do that, though, so everyone start thinking. But you know, we're trying to talk about like the end of the book, really, like the kind of how do we feed ourselves, how do we feed a better future aspect. Obviously, the book starts off a lot about the consolidation of wealth and power in the meatpacking industry, all these different externalities. But I want to talk about, you know, this dichotomy with at the same time, so many people here care about where they get their food.
Sure.
Right? You've probably been told that voting with your dollars really matters. And one of the points that I think we kind of make in the book is that it's not a panacea. It's kind of a false messiah in some ways, because does it really matter what you're buying or how you're buying it when a billionaire is really deciding, or a few corporations are deciding what is accessible in the first place? And there's been a lot of guilt put on consumers that it's on us to drive this change, when at the end of the day, corporations haven't been held accountable. Right. Subsidies really need to be redesigned. Government needs to take way more action. And so I want to talk about that. You know, there's been so much guilt put on consumers, and that's problematic. It shouldn't exist when, of course, obviously when so many people are hungry and there's so much mass, you know, accessibility issues. But how do you deal with that in your work? And do you think it's important to demystify that guilt on consumers?
Yeah, sorry, I thought you were gonna, yeah. No, I think it is important, and I think it's been a burden that folks have either felt. I think we as individuals want to have a call to action. We want to make the change that we want to see in the world, right? That's all we hear, it's all the buzz. I think, to me, the way I've approached it in my work is trying to help folks understand like a spectrum of, what can you do on an individual level? What do you do on a community, level, institutional level, and what's structural? Because we all have different levels of power. There's all different ways we can approach it at levels of power and equity. It could be a positive or a negative, constructive or not. But I think understanding that, so I think the more folks understand that, then it's easier to say like, oh wait, that burden's been put on me, but these decisions are structural, they're systemic. So I think one is just understanding the difference, but also how they play off each other. Because I think sometimes people then take the onus on themselves. I think it also helps in terms of thinking about advocacy and policy is when you start to read certain things or when you start to hear certain policy or you want to take action, then you start to think about, well, what can I do as an individual, whether it's in my personal life or my professional life? What can I do to move my workplace or my institution, my community? But to me, it's also the more you move on that spectrum, the more you're able to identify how you're able to organize and build collective power. So you're no longer then trying to be the David and Goliath to like, oh, I can change this whole system just by me. This is how we get, white saviors and, leaders. And we all are leaders, but if we build collective power together, then we can actually have systemic change, but it's moving on that chain. And I think that's, to me, one of the most elemental ways for folks to understand. So it's not just what you can do as an individual, but where, it's not just voting with your fork, but it's like, what am I doing as an individual that I feel makes a change? What am I doing then to compound and build impact? What do I need to learn about the system in order to either infiltrate the system?
Like you have.
Yeah. Thank you for saying it. And can I still build, power? And how do I build collective power? What do I need to know? What are the tools that I need? Very different than when you're doing it yourself versus when you're trying to attack like the system.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna agree with everything that you just said, and I think just go like, I think, because the way and I agree with everything that you said too, so I wanna just like touch on, I think, areas that to me are most like frightening, which is like going back to like plant-based. Like the amount of people over the last 5 years that are like, plant-based is gonna save the world. And then you look at like the type of ingredients that are going into Beyond Meat or going into Impossible Food and the monoculture and the monocropping and the system that promotes, and it's actually killing the world. And I think that is the scariest piece because we're brainwashed to think that we are powerful and that our food dollars are going to now the right thing because we've changed, because people did change. And I think that's where it's slippery, and to not just trust that like when a company or a campaign taps you on the back that you're doing the right thing. And that's challenging and difficult and at times adversarial. Like you have to kind of literally, when all your friends are like, why are you eating that grass-fed burger? I mean, hopefully it's a grass-fed burger and not just a non-grass-fed burger.
Funny story though about that. Most of what's actually even industrially sold as burger meat actually is the grass-fed that's left over because no one wants it. But that's another thing I learned. Yeah, the Stone Barns 2017 grass-fed beef report. Everybody, go on.
Wow. No, but I think it's that. I think it's like everything that you said, which is building that movement and being a force for change within your group is important. But then also you're going to be fed all of these really smart, really well-funded advertising campaigns that are going to tell you you're doing the right thing. But think again. You might not be. You might be. But I think it's just important to question everything and to...
I know we need to move, and I know folks want to hear Dr. Nestle. But
yeah, we do. Woo, woo, woo.
And Dani, but I appreciate you bringing it up. How do I say this with my food systems hat, I do want to say something. Moment. Okay. I totally agree, Michael, with what you're saying. And I think that the marketing is very slick. And when you have when you have millions, and again, when you're able to build your proof of concept and your story, as opposed to spending time growing food, because the way you're growing food takes time, and soil and water and sun, and that takes a little bit longer than other things. I think in terms of the plant-based, and we think about terms, we can be very plant-powered, we can be very plant-rich if we're thinking about legumes, pulses, fruits, and vegetables. But it's very interesting how certain terms have started to take different connotations versus in the things that we know our body needs to eat. So exactly to your point around the marketing. And also, if we're building alternative products, what you're not necessarily hearing is the energy that it takes to grow or build that way, which is going to, again, come back to bite us. So we have to be smarter. When we say smarter, it's helping each other. Conversations like this, reading that, being smarter about how things are positioned versus like what you know to be true. Again, it just goes back to what are the practices that we knew fed millions? What are the practices that kept a climate healthy and thriving? Is this really working on that? And is this now become a way to tell people how to eat versus how folks can learn? Is it plant-based? Like, do we really need plant-based, or do we need actual fruit and vegetables and other, like a healthy diet? Do we need food security, and is that going to save people from going hungry, or do we need food sovereignty? Because when you start putting power into it, then I don't need to tell you how you're eating. I need to support and make sure that you have healthy soil or whatever medium you're growing your food in to do it. I feel like you're smart enough to grow the way you need to grow and eat the way you need to eat. I don't need to be in one dichotomy to take that and strip it away. So you strip out the ecosystem, you strip out the need for animals in our environment, you strip out the nutrients, but then you're gonna somehow tell me how we're gonna get it back in. How about we start there?
No, I mean, again, being plant-based, it was sort of interesting, because being vegan, like, they didn't use that terminology, because vegan was like the weird hippie thing that like kind of was a fringe thing, and they took plant-based. Like, I think eating vegetables is the way to go, and like we should eat a lot more vegetables and a lot less meat. But it's just different like terminal, and it's not. I don't want to eat like Beyond Burger. I want to just eat like my local farmer's carrots. Like.
But you see how swift our terminology and what we then associate with definitions start to change. Yeah. But again, when you have a lot of time and money to focus on that, it's amazing what you can do. Who knows what I would have done with $50 million thinking about like just CSAs.
And that's why we need to stop wasting the capital that we have. There is also a finite amount, even though there's more rushing into the food world than ever before. Okay, does anyone have any questions before we wrap this up? 1, 2, yeah.
Are you going to talk about the book?
I think we have been. Yes, I am happy to do that. So my book is called Raw Deal, Hidden Corruption, Corporate Greed, and the Fight for the Future of Meat. The first third is really all about the consolidation of wealth and power in the meat industry. I started out at Forbes 9 years ago on the billionaire beat, and so it takes that perspective of, seeing all this accumulation of wealth as I'm doing the net worth valuations you see on our signature lists, and goes into everything we've been talking about, from the antibiotic resistance to the climate problems and the waterway pollution to how to rebuild regional food systems, how to get equity baked into these systems. And it also talks about can a public food sector help alleviate some of this power imbalance and a lot of other things too. But we'll talk about that on the next panel too.
Oh, yeah. You did a great job, I think, with the book. Like, if folks, to me, as I'm reading the book, even if you focus on me, I think it's such a very telling story exactly about the consolidation of power, wealth, how much something that has been so part of our ecosystem, whether it's, for livestock or for hides, like it now became a whole different food track, industrial, but at the same time, how important it still is a part of our ecosystem, how disconnected we've come from it. So I feel like even like down to the language, like why are we against meat, or are we against the way certain meat is raised? Are we against, is it being against meat because it's a personal choice, or are we against meat because of how the system is abuse people? And so I feel like the book is really good at not just talking about meat, but using it as an example of the things we've been talking about, like systems, level, power, and again, like what an individual can do on their own, but how you need to understand what the real systemic change is needed, but you have to understand the system to understand how to break it.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And yeah, we want to keep it light. You know, it's dark, you know, but, you know, we want to keep it positive. We want to be optimistic here.
I love the chapter about, like, the I think it was like monopsony, but it was like, it's not only, the consolidation is not only in the meat industry. It's really like, and I think we can all, like, and we should be careful about monopolies in anything, and the government is supposed to have antitrust, like, there's supposed to be regulation on this, and the book talks a lot about how these big four processors are really skirting that very delicately around this like 25% mark. But you have it in retail with Walmart, you have it in processing, and you have it in farms. The amount of farms has decreased over the last 100 years at a really frightening pace.
Right.
And the average age of our farmer is also, I'll stop talking.
Yeah, monopsony is for another time, but we all play Monopoly, but it's pretty much the same thing, just on the retail side, on the buyer side of things. Two sides of the same coin. If there are no other questions, I think one more, and then we'll wrap up.
Process of selection for a farmer to join a farm people in order to sell the products. And what is actually the return that he
Great
gets
question.
by selling the product?
Yeah, great question. So as we've grown, we've been able to work more and more directly with small farms where we're able to make a bigger and bigger dent. I don't want to discount the value of some of our really great small regional distributors as well. There's Myers Produce in Western Massachusetts to Lancaster Farm Fresh, which is a cooperative in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. But then there are small farms as well that will literally like crop plan with us. We have one in Pennsylvania called Roots to River Farm. We have a farm, it's called Sunsprout Farm in upstate New York in the Chester region, and Dig Acres, which is part of Dig In, but run by an amazing farmer called Larry. And for us, when we work directly with farms, about 50% of every food dollar that you spend goes directly to that farmer. And in a supermarket, the average percentage of a food dollar that goes back to the farmer is about 13%. So 13 cents of every food dollar versus 50 cents.
And that's been getting stripped away over time. They used to have far more, and it's...
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think 50% is a lot, but New York City's expensive, and we try to do our best to succeed and survive as a bootstrap business. So I think like as you grow, and possibly as this regionalized food system that we're trying to build gets economies of scale, I hope maybe more can even go back to the farmer, but this is a start. And a farm should just reach out. We go visit, we want to talk, we want to find out what you're growing, why it's special, and make a relationship.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you for writing this book.
Oh my God, thank you for hosting us. And Qiana, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for hosting us.
Thank
Thanks
you
for
all.
having me here.
I think I'm going to stay
Thank
up
you.
here, and we're just going to do a little quick little change out. Thank you all so much. Okay, so for our final conversation of the evening, I'm so honored and so thrilled to have Dani Nierenberg and Marion Nestle. Oh my gosh, these are two of the most truly inspiring women in this food system, and I'm just so excited to have this conversation. And Dani, we're in your hands.
I love it. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Again, I'm Dani Nierenberg. It is my great honor to be sitting between two of my favorite people in the entire world, people I admire and have learned a lot from over the years. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for supporting Raw Deal. Please, there are a few copies left out there. Keep buying it. I'm just going to put it, I didn't buy this copy. I stole it. So I'm going to put it here for a minute. Someone can have it. But this is such an incredible evening because we are with two really interesting food system experts, and so we have a lot to talk about. Marion, you need no introduction, right? To this crowd,
Icon.
everyone who
Icon.
knows who Dr. Nestle is, yeah? Should I introduce her?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Iconic.
She needs no introduction, but in case somebody brought their roommate or friend here tonight, maybe they don't know. And Chloe Sorvino leads food and agriculture reporting at Forbes and is a great writer and an expert on many food issues, so you should check her out if you don't know who she is, but I'm sure you all do. So Marion Nestle is the Paula Goddard Professor of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health Emerita at New York University, which she chaired from 1988 to 2003, and from which she officially retired, but she has not retired, y'all, in 2017. She's the author of numerous books, including Unsavory Truth, How Food Companies Skew the Science of What We Eat, Food Politics, How the Food Industry Influences Nutrition and Health, and her new memoir, which came out late last year, Slow Cooked, An Unexpected Life in Food Politics. So,
Oh my God, it's so good.
It's so good.
Oh
It's so
my
good.
God,
Yes,
yeah,
round
give
of
her a
applause, big
round.
one,
Oh my
please.
God. It's incredible. Everyone needs to get it, seriously.
Absolutely. That's coming from Chloe. You should do it. So I want to congratulate Chloe on her book again, and really, you know, before we talk about it more and really dig into it, you know, Marion, I want to turn to you first because this is Chloe's first book, right? Yeah.
Not
Right?
bad for a first try.
Only walking because you ran.
Right? Absolutely. Marion, and Slow Cooked was your 15th, right?
Yes.
And so I'm wondering, you know, when we've looked at how the food industry has changed and influenced our lives since you wrote your first book, and now we have Raw Deal, which sort of, you know, is the next in a, you know, what Chloe just said, the sort of arena that you created to write about how
Yes.
the food industry is impacting our lives negatively. And I'm wondering where you sort of see your book, Slow Cooked, and Chloe's new book, Raw Deal, sort of fitting into this library of food politics.
Well, they're united because I wrote a blurb for it. I want to read you my blurb. It's a pretty good blurb,
Oh my God,
actually.
it made me cry, Marion.
It says, Raw Deal is Chloe Sorvino's deeply reported firsthand account of how business imperatives drive the meat industry to mistreat workers, pollute the environment, fix prices, bribe, and manipulate the political process, all in the name of shareholder profits. She argues convincingly for holding the industry accountable and requiring it and other corporations to engage in social as well as fiduciary responsibility. Raw Deal is a must-read for anyone who cares about where our food comes from. When I read a book like this, it just warms my heart. I mean, I was just thrilled to get this book because it takes the kinds of things that I was talking about 20 years ago, brings them right up to the present in a way that, you know, is really granular, I think is the word that everybody's using.
Sure.
That everybody's using these days. So to me, it's just the most exciting thing in the world. I'm asked to blurb a lot of books. I don't blurb all of the ones I'm sent, but I do try to blurb all the ones that I think are good. And there are so many good ones, so many good books coming out. And that, to me, is the most exciting part of it, is that there are so many people who are interested in these issues and interested in them in a serious way, and a serious critical thinking kind of way that get the whole connection between capitalism, the food system, health, and the environment are intimately linked. I don't know any better way. I mean, I just mentioned the word capitalism. 5 years ago, I would never have said it in public. To me, that's an indication of what's changed. Everybody gets it now.
Sure.
Everybody gets it. 5 years ago, it was the C word. You didn't mention it in polite company. If you did, you were called a communist. That's not true anymore. And to me, that is a sign of progress in a situation in which positive signs of progress are few and far between. So we have to treasure the ones that come.
Absolutely.
And I see this as a sign of progress.
Absolutely, it is a total sign of progress, and that this room is filled, that this building exists is, is a sign of progress. So, Chloe, I want to know from you, you know, this book covers a lot of things. What is the takeaway that you want, you know, most people, like my mom, who's a regular person who, you know, smart, but doesn't, you know, study food and agriculture, what do you want people like her to get away from this book? Get from this book?
Well, the status quo has us cratering towards a food insecure future, and we really just don't have enough time to waste. We don't have enough time to start from scratch at the same time, and we really have to take these matters into our own hands now, because by 2030 we really need to have the kinks worked out. We need to be able to have communities be supported in crisis, in dignity, and that's going to take a while to work itself out.
Sure, sure. As was said before, the world's on fire. We need to work these things out now. Do you think we have until 2030?
I mean, there's already been irreversible damage from meatpacking, so it's kind of like we got to push as much as we possibly can, but it's seriously, our future is already locked in it in some ways.
Absolutely, and that's, I mean, that's what your book does so well, is sort of highlight where we are, but it also highlights where we need to go. And we talked about, you talked about with the other panelists on the stage about monopolies and how that's worked. And so I want to talk about this issue of fiduciary responsibility and what that means, fiduciary duty, and sort of the idea of corporate governance and shareholder returns. And you quote Marion in the book. And
this is like the crystallizing quote for me while writing this, honestly. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about
No, please.
No, I don't have it. I don't have it memorized. But you're talking about the context of JBS and the company's desire to go public on the stock exchange. And my question to myself in my notes is, how messed up would that be?
Well, I think Marion should honestly just tell us a little bit about like where she came to that from, because so I quote Marion in the book about why shareholder returns can be so problematic for the food industry. Marion, can you share with us, you know, from that White House, can you share the story of like what you learned at the White House around like the Let's Move campaign and shareholder returns?
I think did I tell the story about going to the White House conference
Yes.
on marketing to children?
Yes.
You know, marketing to children is kind of the line in the sand. It's really not a good thing for food companies to do. They shouldn't be marketing to kids, junk food to kids. And so Michelle Obama had a conference on marketing to kids, and she gave an absolutely eloquent speech about it, and then they divided the group into smaller groups, and the group that I was in had a lot of food industry executives in it, and one of them said, I don't think we should be marketing to children. I wish we could stop, but our shareholders won't let us. And that, to me, was the first time I had ever, I mean, it's what I always thought, but it was the first time I'd ever heard anybody say it in public. And it was, you know, everything was off the record. I'm sorry, I just broke. Well, I'm not saying who said it.
You didn't say the name. You didn't say the name.
I'm not saying who said it. But yeah, I mean, it's just perfectly obvious. And once you get that shareholder value is what drives this, then, and this, by the way, only started in 1981. There's a specific year in which the head of General Electric, Jack Welch, made a speech in which he said, the single most important thing for business is profits to shareholders, and never mind long-term returns on investment. You want higher immediate returns for shareholders right now. And that's what all corporations should be working for. And if you don't work for that, you're out of business. And so that was when the whole business of outsourcing and having business work, you know, having workers in developing countries that weren't paid anything, make clothing and all of these other things. And it was really tough on the food industry because there's already too much food in this country. Well, we have 4,000 calories available every single day for every man, woman, and child in the country. And even if you're overeating enormously, 4,000 calories is twice what you need. So they have to sell food in an environment in which there's too much food. How are they going to do it? Well, they put food where food had never been before. the NYU library, for example. And clothing stores and bookstores. You can eat in bookstores. I'm old enough to remember when you got thrown out of a bookstore if you brought a cup of coffee into it. Now there's a Starbucks in it. And they made food in bigger portions, which is a sufficient explanation for gaining weight. Larger portions have more calories. It's not intuitively obvious. I think that's. But I want to say something about JBS because I write a daily blog at foodpolitics.com.
It's amazing.
And next week I'm going to post something about a statement that President Biden just made about JBS, one of the big four meat packers. And JBS has been fined by the United States government hundreds of millions of dollars for doing very bad things. So somebody asked Biden, aren't we going to stop buying meat from JBS, a Brazilian company? And he said, oh, no, we can't. We can't stop buying meat from them because our consumers want low prices. And I thought, there it is. Mm-hmm. There it is.
I did a whole Twitter thread about it. It blew my mind.
Yeah,
that this
I was just stunned when I saw it. And I'll have to look for that Twitter thread.
Send it to you. I'll send it to you.
Send it to me.
Yeah. I get into all the corruption, all the bribery scheme that no one really knows about because that's why this is
you're not supposed to know about it.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to know about that. You're just supposed to go to the supermarket and buy your food and just be grateful for the fabulous abundance and choices that you have in the supermarket.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem. I do want to go back to shareholders for a minute. And, maybe this is a simplistic or, very simple question for you both, but should food companies be publicly traded?
Nobody should be publicly traded.
I agree. I mean, I hear about this all the time, too. I had a scoop that came out right before Christmas. A Tattooed Chef, a publicly traded company, went public in one of the big SPAC frenzy in 2020. It's a pioneer in plant-based foods. They told me, they confirmed that they were looking at adding a line of meat because they aren't profitable, and now they're getting pressure from their investors, and they have to give, shareholders their returns and the most possible. That's like this question. They have to, legally speaking, they will get sued if they don't, and that's where this gray area, this loophole really comes into play, and it's created huge problems.
Yeah, I think Dani's asking a much deeper question, which isn't there something different about food?
Sure.
That means that we should be treating it differently. Yeah. Food is not a widget. Once it's publicly traded, it's a widget.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
The universe liked that one.
Did I just do that?
Yeah. The meat packers didn't. Yeah.
I just do that. I think our policies need to deal with food as something it's right to food.
Absolutely.
Food is an essential part of everybody's life. It shouldn't be treated as a widget. And that's where, I thought the previous discussion was so interesting about the venture capitalists and how they're coming in there. There shouldn't be venture capitalism involved in food. People need it to live. It's not a widget. The venture capitalism turns food into widgets, and I don't think that's right.
Absolutely. Well, then that leads me to ask my next question. Where do you see this conversation that you had earlier about tech people in the food sector is one that I've thought very deeply about. And these are folks who see an opportunity in food, a business opportunity. And maybe it relates to the shareholder question, too, because these are just people, right? Their minds can be changed. We can have shareholder activism. We can have VCs who actually care about the right to food and food sovereignty. Do you see any hope in that, or am I just being very, very naive?
I go to, every year for the last 30 years, I'm not kidding, I've gone to a meeting of agribusiness at the Harvard Business School. Now it's at the Kennedy School. And I'm sort of their token activist. And I get to talk. I get to speak at every one of these meetings, and for 30 years I've been saying the same thing. But so have they. And from a business standpoint, they all want to change the world. They all want the world to be a better place, but they want to make money at the same time. And so they're looking for business opportunities in the food industry. That's what they care about.
Sure.
And when I'm talking about capitalism and shareholder value and widgets and all these other kinds of things, they hear it, but they can't act on it because the mindset is how can we take this need and exploit it. I'm writing a book chapter about pet food right now.
Oh, I love that.
And it turns out that the COVID pandemic was a growth opportunity in pet food.
Right.
Your interest in health and the environment is a growth opportunity in pet food. There's a lot of money in pet food. You want to invest, that's a good place to
And it's
invest.
driving meat consumption, though. I mean,
Well, it takes the waste of meat
it does,
consumption.
but I do
So
think
it serves
there's-
a useful ecological
although there
process.
are these new startups now that are trying
Like
to do
fresh
the better
fat.
meat
That's
for the
right.
dogs. It's not the waste. And the waste would be great because it takes the
Right.
bone, takes the gristle. But going back to this point, I mean, the reason I really wanted to write this book, I mean, there are a lot of reasons, but I had spent years and years having investors talking to me, salivating, being like, oh my God, it's like the early days of the internet, like so excited they could profit off food because literally that's how these funds work, just like to break it down. There were some, there was never no investment in food, but there was not that much because you can only really eat so much. And the deals weren't very enticing to these investors. But after, a few years, a decade or so of a big SaaS investments, big cloud investments, and these funds making really big money, they then all had money then that they had gotten out of their returns and then had to roll it over into their new funds. And those investors that were in the tech world were in like traditional, cloud, SaaS, real hard tech, different types of valuations, then looked at food as this last frontier of investment. And they thought they could apply the same valuations, the same metrics, the same types of pressures on food companies when we only have one mouth, we only have one stomach, you can only eat so much. And on top of that, the industrial food production system has completely stripped so much health from these foods to begin with. And so it's created this like super unsustainable system. But there are so many investors then that plowed all these profits into this future of food concept. And that's why as the economy now is, retracting a bit, there's been a lot of shakeout. There's been a lot of bankruptcies. There's been a lot of these startups all kind of going bankrupt, or some of their investors are now forcing them to roll up together. And because the investors are the ones calling the shots at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And I feel like a lot of these newer food companies have risen up solving problems that didn't actually need to be solved.
Oh, yeah.
They weren't solving problems for eaters. They weren't solving problems for farmers. They weren't solving problems for retailers. So, I mean, maybe it's a good thing that they're all sort of, going by the wayside now. But I do want to get back to this question of consolidation because that's something that, we see happening every day in the news. Albertsons and Kroger announced late last year that they're merging. There are just 4 firms that control all of our global seed sales. And I want to say that again, 4 firms control all global seed sales. That's ridiculous. I'm looking at Brian Hallwile right now, who is I worked with for many years, who taught me statistics like that. So it made me want to call him out. But, the consequences of consolidation in the meat industry are far and wide. And I want to go back to something that was brought up in the earlier panel about the worker health. We saw so much during the pandemic. And I'm sorry, I keep bringing this up in almost every speech I give. We cannot forget what we saw during the pandemic. The pandemic, by the way, is still happening. But we saw workers suffering so much, and I feel like we've forgotten a lot about that.
Yeah.
So how do we keep, especially in meat processing, how do we keep those stories on the front page of newspapers?
Yeah, in some way, that's why I have a whole chapter dedicated to the human cost of meat, and I go into different stories of harassment, discrimination that are far from before the pandemic, because these workplaces have been so violent and so dangerous for so long, and unfortunately, it took the pandemic for many, many Americans to really have those barriers broken down, because again, these workers are hidden and they're intentionally hidden. That's by design. That's because the meatpackers want it that way. But I will say too, in the meatpacking industry, it really targets and attracts some of the most vulnerable workers in our country: immigrants, refugees, folks that sometimes have no other options. But it's serious. I mean, from the air pollution that's in these plants to the threat of antibiotic resistance and getting a superbug for these workers.
And all those knives.
Yeah, and
Oh my
it's
God,
yeah. The other thing too, I'll say about those knives, right? And then I'll let you go, but I hear all the time about how these are unskilled workers, and that's just so far from the truth.
Right.
It's such a trade, it's such a highly, highly skilled field, and the more that people really start understanding that, the more these workers will be treated with the dignity they deserve.
Absolutely, it's very knowledge intensive. Give a round of applause to that, please. Marion, I don't think 20 or 25 years ago we were putting as much of a human face on the food system as we do now. And if you can talk a little bit about that evolution, because I think it's really important that we've it went from like, lots of white folks, buying local food at their farmers markets, which is great. But like now we're thinking about the food system as a whole and everyone who's involved in it, and the violence in our food system that is inherent, the racism that is inherent in our food system. And I'm wondering, as somebody who's been studying this for a while now, was that evolution surprising to you?
Food systems is a new concept. I mean, it's really only been the last few years. I mean, there were a few people who were talking about it, but it really didn't get into the mainstream until, I'm guessing 5 years ago, when everybody suddenly started talking about systems. People started writing books about farm labor, restaurant labor. I give the people at the Restaurant Opportunities Center an enormous amount of credit for talking about something that I certainly didn't know anything about, which is that restaurant employees are paid tipped employees are paid $2.13 an hour in a lot of states, not New York, but a lot of states. And that was a revelatory.
Absolutely.
I mean, people just didn't know that. And I think if the pandemic did any good at all, it was to shed light on people who work in grocery stores, people who deliver, the delivery workers. Whoever paid any attention to a delivery worker? It's time we did. And and then the business with the workers in the meat packing plants, where Leah Douglas, for example, who was keeping track of, the government was not paying any attention to how many people were getting sick or what the problems were. She was trying to collect that data. It was enormously powerful. And so there are a lot of people who are paying attention to this. It feeds right into our current concerns about redressing long-term wrongs.
Absolutely.
And trying to make amends for what's been neglected for a long time. And I think this is a really hot issue right now. And in listening to the previous panel, it seems to me that the biggest problem that we have to deal with is how do we get farmers to make a living and pay their workers adequately and protect the environment at the same time. That's the challenge.
Yep.
That is the challenge. And everything else is trying to get at that challenge in some way. We don't come close to solving it for historical reasons that lots of people are writing about in very sophisticated ways.
Sure. Chloe, going back to consolidation for a moment, that creates a lot of vulnerabilities that we sort of understood them at the beginning of COVID and maybe, the beginning of last year with the war against Ukraine by Russia. But can you explain how that massive consolidation makes us really vulnerable and risk
Infant formula.
Right, exactly.
Exactly.
It makes us, very at risk to global shocks or, regional shocks.
Absolutely, and it was actually something that we mentioned on the past panel about food security being the new VC buzzword, and that is exactly why I'm hearing that. Food sovereignty is so much more important than food security, I think, for that exact reason, because that term is now being, co-opted. But there has been so much consolidation that has led to all these problems that we're talking about, and, it took the pandemic for many folks to realize it, but for me, it was actually a conversation with Temple Grandin during the pandemic in April of 2020, when she was telling me about when she first realized this. It's this concept that big isn't bad necessarily, but it is really fragile. And when these plants that used to be dotting, across the country, different regional plants, small plants, big plants, medium-sized plants, in cities, outside of cities. Eventually in the 70s, when feedlots really started coming into this industry and changing how meat is made, these plants were getting supersized, getting way bigger, and then getting pushed out to the countryside, also where they're getting more hidden. And it was Temple Grandin talking about, just a storm in 2013 that she was experiencing. She was driving home from the Denver airport, and she got diverted off the highway because there were flooding, and she got so diverted that she actually ended up being at JBS's main feedlot in Greeley, Colorado. This JBS theme comes back again and again. And it took her to realize that, seeing that these cattle were in this feedlot, seeing the flooding lapping against the edges of this feedlot, and just realizing that a few more inches could have completely taken that entire plant out of existence. And we've seen that again in 2021. JBS was attacked by cyber hackers, and their 9 plants in the US and their plants in Australia and New Zealand were all shut down for an entire day. It took out 25% pretty much of the market. There was a fire at a Tyson plant in Kansas that also, because these markets have gotten so consolidated, there are now some regions where they're super uncompetitive. There's maybe only 1 or 2 buyers for these markets, and when one of the plants is taken out from a fire or a cyber attack or what have you, it creates ramifications extremely quickly.
Yeah.
And that's just, again, that's because it's been so centralized, and there's only, a handful of plants really that are responsible for almost all of the meat that goes around the world.
Absolutely, and that's what makes Biden's decision even more sort of unpalatable.
Yeah.
All for cheap meat. It's all for
Yeah.
cheap meat.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there are 4, I think meat is as consolidated as any industry gets. The 4 top meat producers control 85% of the market.
In beef, yeah.
In beef.
Yeah.
All right.
So so what's the solution? How do we break up the consolidation? What are the alternatives that are accessible, affordable for all types of consumers who, don't shop at farmers markets even though we want them
Run
to?
for office.
Yes. And it's like I love when you talk about, local offices, because it's like the institutional purchasing is often what isn't being thought of. And, local school boards, I've heard you speak about that, or local health boards, things that actually can impact how a school or a hospital is purchasing their food, I think is huge. But in general, I think it's all about, trying to counteract these power imbalances that have existed, because unfortunately, antitrust hasn't really done its job, and we're not going to really be able to unscramble the eggs that have already been scrambled. So it becomes a matter of how do we counterbalance that? I read in the book about producers unions and how that can be something to help producers, maintain better control when they're getting a lot of pressure to have contracts. I write in the book a lot about, a public food sector, why universal food access should really be a part of policy and a big priority moving forward.
Yes.
Why is healthcare, why is water, why is education, why do we have a right to that, but we don't have a right to food, when it's just as much, if not more, of a need for everyone.
Absolutely. We're going to take questions in a minute, but yeah. I want to turn back to the conversation that started in the first panel about alternative meats and really focus on cellular agriculture, the cultivated meat industry, and why I know both.
Me and Marion's favorite topic.
I know both of you see it as problematic. So why is it a problem, Marion?
Because it's ultra processed, and there are 3 new concepts in the food and nutrition area that I talk about all the time. One of them is food systems. One of them is what's called triple duty dietary advice, which is dietary advice for diets that simultaneously address hunger, chronic disease, and climate change at the same time. That means diets that are lower in meat and have more plant foods. And the third is ultra-processed, which is a really new concept that describes a specific category of junk foods that's industrially produced. You can't make it in home kitchens. It doesn't look anything like the foods that it came from. And there is now a breathtaking evidence-based that links ultra-processed foods to poor health. And there is a controlled clinical trial that I think is the most important nutrition study done in decades that shows that people who eat diets based on ultra-processed foods take in more calories. 500 more calories a day was what they found, an enormous amount, without realizing it. So that these foods are formulated to get people to eat more than they should. You can't eat just one. Remember that ad? You can't eat just one. They're deliberately formulated that way. People respond to them and don't realize that they're eating more from that. It's an explanation for gaining weight, and weight gain is a risk factor for all of these other things. So what this means is you eat less meat, you eat fewer ultra-processed foods. Guess who doesn't like that kind of advice?
Let me guess.
Tell us.
Take a wild
Tell us,
guess.
Marion.
Take a wild guess. So there is, for example, an enormous pushback against the concept of ultra-processed. There are people writing articles all the time about it's not defined, it's got this problem, it's got that problem. I think it's very important.
Absolutely. So what I want to ask you about is, when I've talked to cultivated meat companies, some about them talk about the need for a just transition and being inclusive and not completely eliminating, traditional or conventional or industrial meat and dairy and eggs. But they're not doing it yet. And as you said, they're not making a profit. So I wonder where you see sort of the power imbalance when we're talking about cellular agriculture.
Oh, I see so much different power imbalance. To begin, I mean, it's got most of the same investors as these
Like Cargill.
Yeah. Big meat packers are now having vested interests in these companies, and I think also, when you talk about how there's a just transition needed, I think they keep that language very vague because some of these lab-grown meat companies, at the end of the day, see their only option for their investors and also for themselves in being acquired by one of these companies at the end of the day, and they're trying to keep that avenue open. So let's always remember where the money's going here. But I think there's just major accessibility issues right now with where lab-grown meat, cultivated meat is, and that's because of a few things. One, it's just super expensive, and it's going to take a lot more capital, and there's already been billions of dollars flowing into this to figure out, a few of the things that they still need to figure out, the growth serum, and some of the scaffolding, and some of the other, also just getting all these bioreactors made, because bioreactors are what's being used for vaccine production, and so there's also like a COVID vaccine, opportunity cost there as well. But there's accessibility in the fact that it's never going to actually be sold at an actual profitable, financially sustainable place. But these investors are right now, if they are selling it, they're selling it at a loss. They're just taking the loss. So they're kind of creating manufactured demand almost for these products because they actually have to compete with companies that are needing to have sustainable bottom lines at the end of the day. But then also there are a lot of investors that are investing mostly in the lab-grown startups that are attacking like the high-end part of the market or like the luxury part of the market. And if this technology, which actually is quite innovative and quite revolutionary, if it is used to just be like a stake for the bankers in 2050 at the end of the day, I think that's just a major flaw with where all this capital and money is going. If it's not accessible, if it's not used, I talk about the only place I really want it to be used for, if it had an open source history, it doesn't really anymore, but if it was used as part of a public food sector, I could see that, having some potential, accessibility. But right now, there's those problems, and then the other thing is that, meat is a natural product at the end of the day. There obviously are genetics, there's different processes, there's different patents involved, but livestock is natural, it's a biological process. But now there are all these investors, many of them billionaires, who are now coming in and, taking up the intellectual property for these companies. Most of them aren't patents, most of them are, kind of proprietary, and that's leading to a very small few thinking that they will have the entire code to how we eat protein in the future.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about Upside and what happened with them, I guess, a few weeks ago now?
Yes, actually it was funny. One of their advisors was interviewing me, a former USDA Ag Secretary was interviewing me for C-SPAN, and we were talking about how, this big expected cultivated meat, decision was about to be announced any moment, and it actually was announced directly when we were, doing this interview.
Sure.
But so Upside is one of the leading cultivated meat companies that's based in Silicon Valley. They had been working with the FDA for a while to see if they could start selling commercially, and in November, the FDA decided there are no questions for what they had essentially had submitted. So it's a big next step. It's not a final green light, but we are going to start seeing cultivated meat start selling really soon, potentially in the U.S. probably even within the next few months. And
Yeah.
Being sold in Singapore.
Yes, exactly, and at a loss, right? It's like Josh Tetrick's company that they're selling it, and they're putting it out for a loss because they can, because they have a lot of billionaire investors behind them who want it and have a vested interest in seeing it succeed.
Absolutely. I do want to turn to Q&A in a moment, but before I ask my final question, I want to remind people to buy slow cooked.
Slow cooked.
Marion Nestle's.
Not for sale here.
Marion Nestle's memoir, but you can find it wherever you buy books, hopefully at an independent bookstore. And also to buy Raw Deal, Chloe Sorvino's new book. And again, congratulations, Chloe. We're so excited for you. So my final question, yes, round of applause, everyone. Thank you.
I love it when you're mean and you're just like, round of applause.
My final question, and I always want to end on hope because I think now more than ever, given what's happening in the world, we need to end on hope. Marion, what gives you hope around our food and agriculture systems?
Everybody who's in this room.
Round of applause for that.
Absolutely.
All these young faces, too.
I mean, I teach people. I have students who want to use food to change the world. How can I not have hope?
That's great. That's great. Chloe, final word.
Yeah, I mean, I have hope that there are more people than ever before who at least say they have a vested interest in making a difference and trying to, be those, folks working in these companies, making the change, even if they're, not being seen, not having that be their public story. And just, we have a farm bill coming up, right? I'm optimistic about the farm. I mean, maybe I shouldn't be. Maybe that's like,
I'm optimistic.
Yeah, I know. It's just so important. It's going to be the funding for the next 5 years. It's like the most crucial 5 years we've got left, right? So I don't know. I have to be at least a little optimistic until it turns south, but it might very soon.
Again, congratulations, Chloe. I wanted to end on hope. All right, you have a question.
Yeah, I think regulation is probably one of the things that's in some ways fewest used, but some of the most powerful among the tools we have to address some of the change that needs to happen. You can talk about, extreme types of policies. You could, soda tax. What about a meat tax? That's happening in Europe, actually. You also could talk about just simple fundamental things like why are subsidies being given to farmers who are, farming corn and soy industrially when if they simply added cover crops in, that would actually cause a lot of good, even if they still remain, farming industrially with pesticides that are hurting our soil and hurting our waterways. Why are we giving subsidies and not even using simple requirements like that to somewhat, change what's happening? It can happen on pretty much any level. Public food sector too. Why is there not an actual food emergency response arm for our country when we are barreling towards crisis? And there already are extreme weather events that are killing people and are taking out our food system. I don't know.
But is that politicians, as you suggested, or is it career?
I think it's both. I think it's all of it.
The Department of Agriculture is in charge of all this, and the Department of Agriculture, I once heard a very high official in the Department of Agriculture say that he didn't think Americans should grow food at all.
Oh gosh.
He thought it could be done so much more cheaply in developing countries. And the Department of Agriculture, from a historical perspective, has always been against small farms. Its attitude is there are too many farmers, they're too inefficient, they're not using things efficiently enough. And remember, fruits and vegetables are specialty crops. you have to remember that part. So the Department of Agriculture is not interested. There's tokens. There's tokens for organics. There are now smaller tokens for regenerative agriculture. It's sort of sneaking in very, very small ways. And if the political pressures are great enough, maybe it'll get bigger ways if there's a change in government. Run for office. We need a change in government. We really do. how are we going to get it? People have to run for office.
The marriage between business and government, I don't think can ever be over-articulated.
Not the way our election campaigns run. You know, I mean, then the only way to change that is to have people in government who change the laws.
We need campaign finance reform. We need to get the money out of politics.
We need to overturn Citizens United. I mean, there's a lot of things that, you know, but that's probably the single most important thing to do, is Citizens United. And there are lots of groups that are working on that, but they're not getting very far right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a question in the back. Yeah. Can you stand up? Thank you.
And shout.
Thank you.
Run for office.
My book has a section in the conclusion about how this could potentially work, and I think there are very many. It's an extreme. There's a maximum. There's a minimum. It could be as simple as every zip code, you know, having a warehouse or a distribution arm to, again, as more of an emergency response. But it could go as far as to say, you know, why there are many countries where there, you know, are cafeterias, places where people get food, where it is totally normal for all walks of life to get food there, because there is a right to food, and that's another kind of extreme end of it. But it really depends, and the point is that the government has a huge amount of purchasing power themselves, and right now almost all of it is going towards problematic industrial things that are just to be as cheap as possible.
I want to just go back to the pandemic. We had two things during the pandemic. We had universal basic income, and we had universal school meals. They stopped. Bring them back.
Right.
And that solves the problem. If people have money to buy food, they can buy food on the regular economy, and we won't need this completely separate, parallel food system that gives food away to people.
Absolutely. There was a question over here. Yes. Please stand up. No, it's you.
I was wondering if you could talk about the Farm Bill a little bit, historical context, as well as what are the biggest risks right now.
Oh boy.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, I can do this.
Yeah, you do it.
I wrote an article for Politico once called "The Farm Bill Drove Me Crazy." That was its title. And it was because in the 2008 Farm Bill, I got the bright idea. I didn't understand the Farm Bill very well, so I thought, I'll teach a class in it. And that was hubris. You want to know a definition of hubris? It's teaching a class about the Farm Bill without knowing anything about it. Woo! Not a great teaching experience. It's 1,000 pages of very small print. It covers hundreds of programs. Every one of those programs has a complete set of lobbyists associated with it and people who know how it works. Nobody else does. It's completely impossible to understand, and 80% of it is food stamps. And I think the fight over the Farm Bill this time is going to be like nothing we've ever seen before, because the right-wing Republicans want to get rid of food stamps. They can't pass a farm bill unless food stamps are in there. That's what President Johnson did. That's the historical point. In 1964, President Johnson knew that he could not pass a Food Stamp Act, and he could not pass a support system for corporate agriculture, that he didn't have the votes to do either one, so he linked them together. And therefore, he was called log rolling, and that was how it got passed. It hasn't changed. And so the groups that want to separate food stamps out, the SNAP program out, they're not going to get anywhere. I mean, and it's going to be, if you didn't care and if it didn't matter, it would be fun to watch.
Any other thoughts on the Farm Bill?
No, I was just gonna. I love that history lesson. That's definitely Johnson's probably best thing he did. I'd say, like linking those two things together, right?
Absolutely.
Controversial.
Any other questions? Yes.
How many lobbyists do we have compared to how many lobbyists they have?
Oh God.
Oh, zero.
Yeah.
I mean, no, I mean, that's part of the problem. Their lobbyists get paid. And that's the real problem, that for food groups, for the food movement in quotation marks, because I'm not sure it can be a movement unless all of the groups that are working on these problems join together. This is what Dani is trying to do, is to bring these groups together. If everybody was together, you could hire a lobbyist and pay a lobbyist to do what they do. But when I wrote my book, Soda Politics, I counted the number of lobbyists that the American Beverage Association, Coke and Pepsi, had. There's a website where you can look this stuff up. And there were 67 in Washington, 67 lobbyists for the soda industry. And that was enough lobbyists to visit every single congressional representative and every senator every year. And inform them.
Can you speak to the return, the money they put in versus the programs they get out?
Oh, I mean, their returns are enormous. They stop legislation that might tax sodas, for example. They stop that. They keep legislation that allows them to act the way they want to. And they get what they want. And they do that through donations, through legislation. It doesn't, the amazing thing that I discovered when I was writing that book was you can buy a legislature for not very much money.
Not very much money.
It's not very expensive. $5,000 will do it. A few groups ought to be able to put $5,000 up. And you go and inform them. That's how it works.
Oh, I'll just give one stat too on that. In the meat industry, lobbying in the past decade on only environmental issues, so not any lobbying on squeezing out small players or independents or anything like that. That was around $200 million for the past decade. Yeah.
Incredible.
Only environmental issues. Yeah, like eating away at the Clean Water Act. So
for sure. Not a great stat to end on, but I want Chloe to sign her book.
We have lots of work to do.
We do have lots of work to do, and I want to thank all of you for coming. Chloe's going to do a book signing. I love these women so much. They have taught me so much over the years, so please give them a round of applause.
Dani, thank you. Marion, this was like a dream come true conversation, so thank you so much. This is,
and
thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Get your book signed, buy another book.
Yes, thank you all for being here. Have more food,